Welcome, everyone. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and this is Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. Last week, we did a video where we answered the question, is Mexico safe for American tourists? Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's listened to it, everyone who's commented, anyone who did a thumbs up, and thank you to anyone who subscribed. When we did that video, we said we're going to do one or two kind of introductory videos to get us thinking about drug trafficking, Mexican cartels, and those sorts of things. And so we went through and analyzed some issues relating to tourists in Mexico. Today, we're going to go ahead and do one more of these introductory preview type videos, and we're going to answer another question that gets raised quite a bit. And that is, why should Americans care about Mexican drug trafficking, Mexican cartels? And we're going to do a few things to answer that question. So, number one, we're going to talk about the drug trade, drug use in America, its impacts. I've got a bunch of statistics here that we'll talk about. Then we're going to do a very high-level overview of the Mexican cartels and kind of their influence in the United States. I say very high level because we're going to do a much deeper dive in the next video coming up, which is going to be a short history of Mexican cartels. And then the last thing we're going to do in answering this question is look at a few of the maybe less pronounced, more nuanced effects of the drug trade in America and drugs flowing from Mexico into the United States. All right, let's start with drug trafficking, drug issues in America. Almost every statistic you see will say that from the period, let's say let's just use 1917 as a good starting point, until someplace in 2022, no question that the amount of drugs flowing from Mexico into the United States increased, and the number of deaths arising from those drugs increased, even if the particular types of drugs changed. One of the things that's really hard in looking at statistics and things is you're always looking a little bit behind. So by the time data comes out, data can be not useful, not helpful. Things can change. The market can change. Different fentanyl has replaced heroin and cocaine in a way that probably nobody really saw coming 2 years ago. You also have the concern of looking at things on a month-to-month basis as opposed to a bigger overview. So is 1 month a trend? Probably not. Is 2? Is 3? Does it take 6? And one thing I will say is we have seen a little bit of a trend, let's say from mid-2022 to today, where there's been less drug deaths. Certainly not less usage, but less deaths, and lots of potential reasons for that. But, and again, I'm going to show you some statistics in just a second. However you want to look at it, the number of deaths is staggering. It's too many, and it's a public health concern. All right, here's some statistics that I think are really important. During the 12 months that ended April 2022, again, you're always looking a little bit back, drug deaths in the United States, so year over year, 1 year, April 21 to April 22, increased by at least 7%. 7%. And, you're now up to well over 100,000 deaths a year. We could break this down in a whole bunch of different ways, but we're probably, I don't want to focus too much just on the deaths. Now, what else do we know about the drugs coming into the United States? Almost all of the drugs coming into the United States either originate in Mexico or go through Mexico. Let me say that again. Almost all of the drugs used in and trafficked to the United States either originate in or flow through Mexico. That makes Mexico a big issue if you're talking about the war on drugs, if you're just talking about public health concerns. Here's some really amazing statistics. So for the fiscal year 2021, The U.S. Customs and Border Protection data says that they seized 11,201 pounds of fentanyl, 5,400 pounds of heroin, 319,000 pounds of marijuana, 191,000 pounds of methamphetamine, 98,000 pounds of cocaine, and almost 11,000 pounds of ketamine. In July and August 2022, remember, let's just go back real quick. So 11,201 pounds of fentanyl seized in fiscal year 2021. In July and August 2022, 4,500 pounds of fentanyl was seized. So in 2 months, you had almost half of a yearly supply. A recent study of heroin that has been seized, did samples and things, said that 90% of the heroin sampled originated in Mexico. 90%. That's right. I mean, that's pretty incredible stuff if you think about it. And again, we could talk about a whole lot of other data, but the very simple fact of the matter is that drugs flow from Mexico either because they originated there, they were grown there, or they come from other places. And we can talk about that for a second. So historically, Mexico didn't grow a lot of cocaine, poppies. Cocaine wasn't produced in Mexico very much, but it was produced predominantly in Colombia and other places. And Mexico, you go way back to 1980, the early 1980s, Felix Gallardo, Juan Mata Ballesteros, and others kind of made that connection between the Colombian cartels and the United States and provided a route, a traffic route, a way to get cocaine from South America into the United States. That has continued over time. It's grown over time. In addition, there are other places where, especially synthetic drugs come from: Malaysia, India, China, of course, China. And a lot of those drugs come from wherever they're sourced into Mexico and then are distributed from Mexico into the United States. That's particularly true with respect to fentanyl. It's believed that a lot of the fentanyl that comes into the United States through Mexico has origins in labs in China. Again, there's other places as well. And Mexico is now working on creating a lot more of its own fentanyl, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So, however you break it down, you've got pretty significant cartel-related issues, right? What else do we know? If you look at drug trafficking indictments in the United States, and you look at the top 5 federal districts where those indictments are, what do you find? Western District of Texas, Southern District of Texas, District of Arizona, Southern District of California, District of New Mexico. I don't think I need to get our world map out and let you know where all of these districts lie. They lie on the border of the United States and Mexico. Makes perfect sense, right? So we can all agree, right? A real serious problem with drug trafficking into the United States. It's a public health issue. And most of those drugs come from Mexico or through Mexico. We know that. Now, what do we know about the cartels? We know for sure, and again, keep in mind, we're going to really talk about the cartels, their structure, their leadership, a lot more in a week or two as we do other videos. But for now, we can assume, and I think that this is a very good assumption, that almost all of the drugs that come from Mexico into the United States, regardless of origin, are controlled by or trafficked by a cartel in some form or another. Okay, let's work with that. So, too many drugs come in the United States. Almost all of them come from Mexico, and cartels control almost all of those drugs. We could stop here and say that, folks, is why Americans should be concerned about the cartels in Mexico. But we're going to go a little bit further. We're not going to, again, I don't want to talk too much about the history of cartels today, but the cartel system in Mexico kind of got set up in about 1989 when a variety of territories were assigned, for lack of a better purpose or a better term, to a variety of folks. And then they created this cartel system. And the cartel system is dominated by territory. There were certain, the cartels are in control of certain territories, tends to be dominated by big leadership figures, and the cartel system has grown from when it started and has become far more violent as the volume of drugs, the amount of money involved has changed. The battles between cartels has increased. So, who are the major cartel players in Mexico today? Number one, you have the Sinaloa cartel. Okay. This is probably the oldest, the largest, the most international, the most extensive cartel there is. Most people in America would know it because that's where El Chapo was. Okay. He was a head or in a leadership position of the Sinaloa cartel prior to his arrest and extradition. What do we know about the Sinaloa cartel going into the United States? Big into distribution of methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, but I think it's fair to say that they were a little bit late to the game. Sorry, adjusting there. They were a little bit late to the game on fentanyl. They have tentacles throughout the United States, and they have significant operations in Phoenix, Los Angeles, Denver, Atlanta, Chicago, Anchorage, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. I mean, these are places where arrests have been made recently that reveal the length and breadth and scope of the reach of the Sinaloa cartel. There was an organization called the Beltran Leyva Organization, BLO, and it was really formed with a few brothers, all of whom have since been either arrested or killed. They still have some influence in the United States in kind of whatever form they've taken now. So we still see them referred to as BLO, and they continue to operate in places in Mexico and in the United States, oftentimes kind of in alliance with larger cartels. So you've got some people who worked in the BLO, and even after it kind of splintered off or the leadership went away, they've stayed in place and now work with kind of as independent contractors for larger cartels. And they've got a couple different groups that are notable, but for our purposes, BLO, very influential in Los Angeles, Phoenix, Chicago. And note, you're going to see some of the same names for cities. And when you start looking at them, you can start seeing the distribution routes. You can see, it's almost like the Greyhound routes connecting to the big cities in different locations. Los Angeles, Phoenix, Denver, Chicago, Atlanta. Boom, you do that, and you've got the mainland U.S. pretty well covered. All right, one of the big ones that you may have heard about is a cartel called Cartel Jalisco New Generation. All right, that's the gringo pronunciation, CJNG. They're relatively new. Started in about 2010, more or less-ish. They have a leader by the name of El Mencho, who is one of the strongest, most notable cartel leaders, frankly, ever. Hasn't been captured, wanted, but somehow survives. And the CJNG is notable for being a pretty brutal cartel. And when we go into our dive into the cartels themselves, we're going to talk about that, and I'll share some things that aren't not safe for work. Isn't that what they say? CJNG, though, very popular in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and again in Atlanta. You also have a cartel called the Gulf Cartel, which is more prominent. It used to be much bigger, more prominent now in Houston area, kind of that area of Texas, and also still has remnants in Detroit. So again, start looking at the map. You could see how it unfolds. There's a cartel called the Juarez Cartel or La Linea. They're very well known in areas including El Paso and Denver, Oklahoma City. There's a cartel called La Familia Michoacana or La New Familia Michoacana. We'll talk about that later. They are the fentanyl group, right? They are probably the biggest manufacturer, distributor of fentanyl from Mexico into the United States, and that's put them on everybody's radar. And then there's a couple of others with some continuing activity. There was the Tijuana Cartel, which was the Arellano Felix organization. They're a lot like who were we talking about earlier? We were talking about the Beltran Leyva organization, and they made the Tijuana Cartel. The Beltran Leyva, or the Arellano Felix brothers are all gone. There's still some family members there, but that cartel really got dismantled. But it's such a popular route that other cartels have come in, and there may be remnants of that Tijuana cartel that have more power now because they're starting to affiliate with the bigger groups, either the CJNG or the Sinaloa. Okay, so that's our short look at cartels. What does this tell you, though? It says we have in Mexico, when we look at Mexico, we see a very defined structure of cartels that have particular niches, particular geographic territories, both in the United States and in Mexico, have distribution routes and have long histories. In addition to these big cartels, the DEA says there are probably someplace between 200 to 400 smaller gangs, smaller affiliations, groups that aren't really cartels but work with cartels, either one on a regular basis or on an ad hoc basis. Something else I want to implore you to think about. If you start hearing about cartels, if you're interested in them, there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of people who talk like they know what they're talking about, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. You got to be really careful in what you accept as true. You can go on Reddit right now and say, who are the top lieutenants for El Mayo, and you'll get 20 different names, and no real way of knowing if 19 of them are right or 19 of them are wrong. So be careful. Last week, all over social media, at least the social media for us geeks who follow this stuff, that Rafael Caro Quintero had escaped from prison. Didn't happen. All right, back to our question. Why should Americans care about the cartels? They should care because cartels control the drugs that go from Mexico into the United States. And they should care because almost all of the drugs that are causing the public health crisis, that are causing the overdoses in the United States, either come from or through Mexico, and thus are controlled by the cartels. Okay, so that's the simple answer. Let's look at a couple of things that are a little less obvious. There's a perception, I think, that everybody who runs drugs for the cartels is from Mexico or Mexicans, and I don't know. But when you think about it, if you've got distribution routes in Detroit and Denver and Atlanta, there's a whole network of people. And there's some really interesting statistics when you look at who gets arrested in connection with drug trafficking or drug smuggling operations. So based on recent statistics for the 2021 fiscal year, about 70% of the people arrested for drug smuggling from Mexico into the United States were U.S. citizens. 70%. Here's a crazy stat. Almost half of them, had no previous criminal history. But the drug trafficking, the money, I mean, that's a strong allure for a lot of people, right? Between 2011 and 2015, there was about a 75% increase in the number of people sentenced for crimes relating to heroin trafficking in the United States. In 2015, the DEA made 6,000 arrests for heroin-related offenses. That almost doubled by 2021. The point being that, the impact of drug trafficking from Mexico to the United States is felt directly in the United States, not just through the drug usage, but you have people bringing, helping in the smuggling operations, helping in the distribution operations, who are American citizens, who are people in the United States when they're arrested. What impact does that have on their communities, on their families, those sorts of things? Okay? So that's one kind of nuance I want you to think about. Nuance number two, which should be obvious, is the DEA suspects, and this comes from the DEA itself, that they catch about 5 to 10% of the drugs coming from Mexico into the United States. Okay? So however much we talk about drug seizures and whatever statistic we look at, they're wrong. It's much, much, much larger than we know, or at least than the statistics will show. Number three, what about tourism? I almost feel guilty about saying this, but what is one of the biggest tourist spots for Americans? Mexico, right? Cancun, Tulum, Cabo, Puerto Vallarta, other places. There are internal cities that are gorgeous with a vast history. Mexico City, if you want to study the Mayas, I went to Chichen Itza. It's the most incredible place I've ever been in my life. To call it spiritual would be an insult to things that are spiritual. So there's so much there, and yet we have people who are concerned about going down, and that affects both Americans wanting to go down. There's tourist companies, there's airlines, there's whatever else, and it also affects a lot of average people in Mexico, right? I mean, think about the number of people who have tourism as part of their living in Mexico, one way or another. It's got to be huge. And the more Americans don't want to go, the more Europeans don't want to go because of the cartel violence and related activities. That has a profound effect on both sides of the border, and I think it has ripple effects. The other one that is tied directly to that is think about the border towns. You think about Brownsville, think about Laredo, El Paso, Nogales, even San Diego. Right on the border, lots and lots of interaction back and forth, economic trade, people who make their livings on both sides of the border, people with families on both sides of the border. if we end up in a situation where more radical things need to be done to combat the drug trafficking, how is that going to impact those cities in particular, both economically and more profoundly personally, right? I mean, do you want to be in a situation, whatever side of the fence you fall on, no pun intended, with respect to politics, do you want a fence, an ironclad fence between Mexico and the United States so that we end up with a Berlin problem? Families on both sides who can't communicate, who can't touch each other. That the human scale of this is important and is significant. And I want to address one last thing. There are people, including people in Congress, who say, let's use the military to go after the cartels. Well, a couple of things. Number one, it's not like, they have the Sinaloa Cartel High School and you know where they all are and they all meet at the Sinaloa Cartel Elks Lounge on Friday nights. And you can just go in, you can attack them, you can bomb them, you can do whatever with them, and you're not going to have any collateral damage. That's not how it works. These people are all over the place. They don't walk around with uniforms. Not everybody has a cartel jersey on. So number one, that's just silly. But more importantly, if you still have a demand, if you got rid of all the Mexican cartels tomorrow, that would do nothing to the demand in the United States, right? Do you really think that void won't be filled somewhere? Whether it's coming from China, India, Africa, South America, wherever. It's a two-way street, supply and demand. And until both of those are fixed, I don't think you're ever going to have a real viable solution to the problem. And simply focusing on the Mexican cartels is not, in and of itself, going to fix the problem. All right. That, my friends, was a quick answer to the question of why should Americans care about the Mexican cartels? Because it really affects them in a lot of different ways. I appreciate you listening. If you have comments, put them below. If there's other things you'd like to know more about, leave comments. If you got anything out of this, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and look for another video in a few days where we're going to do our brief history of Mexican cartels. That's going to be fun. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.